In the morning, the trauma bay doors flew open with such force that one slammed against the rubber stopper and bounced back, the crack of it sharp enough to sound like a gunshot in the white corridor. Rain came in with the paramedics, slicking the stretcher rails and darkening the shoulders of everyone who ran beside the gurney. Monitors shrilled, rubber soles struck tile in fast succession, and the whole emergency department seemed to cinch itself tighter around the incoming crisis. In the center of that violent motion, the quietest person in the room was also the one everyone on night shift had spent months underestimating. Lena Morales was already moving before the attending physician finished shouting for space. One gloved hand settled on the patient's shoulder, the other checked the line at his neck, and her eyes traveled over the broad chest, the cut uniform, the dog tags pressed into gauze, the graying face, and the mechanical rhythm of a body trying not to lose the argument with shock. While Dr. Everett Sloan demanded respiratory, demanded his senior, demanded order in the particular tone of a man who mistook volume for control, Lena listened to what the patient's body was saying in smaller, truer signals. The man on the stretcher flickered in and out of consciousness. His face, even through pain and blood loss, had the kind of controlled hardness that came from years of discipline, and the military escort trailing him moved with a restraint that made ordinary hospital urgency feel theatrical by comparison. One torn black patch on his vest meant something serious to them, though Sloan treated it as irrelevant. To him, the patient was another emergency to dominate, and Lena was another night nurse who needed to stay in the place he had assigned her. Then the patient's eyes opened just enough to find her shape under the fluorescent lights, and with the last of his breath, he formed a single word meant only for her. He whispered the call sign Ren. 3 medics froze so abruptly that it looked rehearsed. One stared at Lena with the stunned expression of someone who had just watched a dead name walk back into the world. Sloan did not notice any of that. He was still performing command, barking for instruments and updates and verbal confirmation of his own authority. Lena kept her attention on the uneven rise of the patient's chest, on the lag on the left side, on the pulse threatening to vanish beneath her fingers, and on the asymmetry that kills while louder men keep talking. She asked one transport medic what had happened before the helicopter touched down and got the answer she needed. There had been blast overpressure during a maritime exercise, then a secondary impact, then a brief code in the aircraft. That told her what the body was already confirming. He needed decompression immediately. Sloan rejected the conclusion in the reflexive way insecure men reject expertise when it comes from the wrong mouth. He insisted on imaging, insisted she not freelance in his bay, insisted on the kind of order that would have buried the patient before the scan was complete. When she reached for the tray, Sloan caught her wrist and threatened her job in a low, deliberate voice meant to sound controlled and therefore reasonable. The room went still in the ugliest possible way, not silent but watchful, the kind of stillness that appears when everyone knows a line has been crossed and waits to see who will pay for it. Lena slipped free, told him with perfectly level calm to remove his hand, and then, because the patient was already crashing, she acted. She inserted the needle cleanly. Air hissed. The chest rose more evenly almost at once. Saturation climbed just enough for everyone in the room to feel the shape of the mistake that had nearly been made in the name of hierarchy. By dawn, half the hospital would behave as if they had respected her all along. A convoy with army plates would pull under the emergency awning asking for one person by name, and before the end of the shift, an entire system built on confidence, polish, and rank would be forced to confront why a wounded SEAL commander had used a call sign instead of her civilian name, why officers from multiple branches were crossing command lines to reach a civilian registered nurse on a forgotten overnight shift, and why the people who actually know the most almost never need to announce it. But before any of that could happen, the story belonged to the long, fluorescent, airless hours that came first, because vindication is never just the dramatic reveal. It is also the endurance that made the reveal necessary. St. Catherine's Regional sat 4 miles from the Norfolk waterfront, close enough to hear helicopters on clear nights and close enough to receive the kinds of patients who arrived under escort and left without names displayed on public boards. In daylight, the hospital lobby tried hard to look charitable and polished. It was all soft seating. Donor plaques, potted plants, and carefully reassuring language. At night, the place belonged to floor wax, vending machines, tired shoes, and the social hierarchy that grows especially mean when too few people are awake to challenge it. Lena Morales worked the overnight trauma float. She was 34, wore her dark hair in the same practical not every shift, and kept a thin silver band on a chain under her scrub collar rather than on her hand. She signed charts early, spoke only when speech added value, and moved with a kind of disciplined economy that made other people look sloppy without her ever seeming to try. In a healthier workplace, that would have earned quiet respect. At St. Catherine's, it earned suspicion. The daytime staff called her the ghost when she was not around. Younger residents called her library because she always seemed to know policy before they had finished skimming it. Sloane preferred the phrase quiet nurse, and he used it the way some people use rank to shrink another person into a manageable category. Everett Sloane was the type of trauma attending who mistook confidence for noise and noise for leadership. He had the polished credentials, the expensive watch, the flawless hair, and the donor-friendly smile that made administration forgive what should have been warning signs. He liked admiration that arrived quickly and visibly, and he disliked any form of expertise that demanded he do extra work to recognize it. Lena demanded that work from him without ever asking for anything. She corrected charts when they were wrong, not when it was politically convenient. She did not flatter him in front of residents. She did not laugh at his jokes to smooth over his vanity. Worst of all, she was often right in ways that left him feeling slower than he looked. 2 weeks before the night Commander Thorne arrived, Lena had corrected a trauma note in which a potassium value had been entered in the wrong field. Sloane had used the moment to remind her, in front of others, that a nurse was not hired to edit physicians. Lena had answered that the patient needed the right dose more than the right costume. 2 interns had nearly laughed aloud. Sloane had smiled the way men smile when they promise themselves they will remember an insult long after everyone else has gone back to work. At St. Catherine's, that kind of grudge did not erupt all at once. It became procedural. He interrupted her handoffs, corrected statements she had not made, reassigned her to the least visible work when donors toured, and referred to her as support staff in front of military families who knew enough to notice the disrespect. Lena did not fight in the way the institution expected. She did not gather sympathy in the break room or perform righteous anger for allies. She documented. She worked. She kept her face still. That irritated people more than defensiveness ever would have, because calm made their own pettiness feel visible. There were details everyone noticed without understanding. Lena never flinched when helicopters landed. She tied tourniquets faster than anyone in the department had ever seen. She used the phonetic alphabet automatically when equipment failures piled communication into a knot. Once, when a delivery driver fainted in the loading bay, she dropped to one knee and ran the scene so efficiently that the security officer later remarked it had felt less like an accident and more like watching someone return to a language they had not spoken in years. No one asked her directly where that came from. Or rather, no one with enough authority and humility to hear the answer asked. Most people preferred guessing. Maybe she had been a paramedic somewhere rural. Maybe she had worked corrections. Maybe she had simply memorized procedures better than most nurses. In environments addicted to quick ranking, mystery easily becomes insult. Only one person in the hospital's recent chain of command had known more. When Lena had been hired, she had submitted every credential requested, every license, every civilian training record, and one sealed federal notation that the administrators had quietly filed rather than study too closely. The chief nursing officer at the time had retired 3 months later, and the replacement never dug into the restricted material. That omission lay unnoticed in a personnel cabinet until the morning it would become relevant enough to cost powerful people their certainty. Until then, Lena remained what the hospital found most comfortable, useful, efficient, and vaguely suspect in her competence. At 1:40 that same night, before the helicopter, before the convoy, before the whisper in the trauma bay rearranged the moral architecture of the floor, Lena stood alone in supply restocking chest tubes. Rain tapped the narrow window in the service hall. Somewhere down another corridor, a floor buffer hummed like a tired machine refusing sleep. The overhead lights emitted that buzzing electrical. Weariness hospitals seem to acquire after midnight, when even the fixtures feel overworked. Patris Heller, the charge nurse on nights, appeared in the doorway with a clipboard and the expression of someone preparing to deliver a small administrative rebuke she believed counted as leadership. She informed Lena that Bay 3 had been swapped without clearance. Lena answered that the airway cart seals had been broken and the oxygen wall port had been dropping pressure, so she had moved the trauma overflow rather than risk someone bagging a patient through a compromised line. Patris checked the clipboard, found the maintenance notation, and visibly disliked that the evidence backed Lena. Patris was not inherently cruel. She had simply learned the professional survival habit of siding upward. In hospitals, that habit can cause nearly as much damage as open malice because it allows systems to call themselves functional while punishing the people who compensate for their weakness. She said she was still putting a note in, not disciplinary, just documentation. Lena acknowledged it without argument. Patris lingered, then added that Lena made things harder than necessary, that if she smiled more or explained herself more, people might not assume she thought she was above them. Lena asked what exactly they assumed. Patris did not finish the sentence, which told the truth well enough. Lena answered that no one who genuinely thought she was above others would be restocking supply rooms at 1 in the morning. Patris had no answer to that and left. Alone again among the sterile packaging and half-stocked bins, Lena let out one slow breath and stood perfectly still. It was not defeat. It was the fatigue that comes from compressing your competence so other people can remain comfortable in their insecurity. At 2:06, the first breadcrumb arrived disguised as routine information. A coastal storm line reduced visibility over the water, medevac routes shifted inland, and harbor rescue traffic increased. Incoming screens flickered with coded notices that most civilian staff skimmed and forgot. Lena did not skim. She read each line carefully. One message in particular mattered. It referenced a joint exercise casualty, maritime origin, and secure handling priority. Her eyes paused on that wording for less than a second. Then she called Central Supply and requested 2 additional blood warmers, 1 portable ultrasound, and backup suction to be staged without waiting for a formal physician request. The clerk sounded annoyed and asked whether they were expecting a mass arrival. Lena answered that they were expecting the kind of case that feels small until it is not. That was the first sign. The second sign came minutes later when an intern named Caleb Dunn drifted by with a coffee, wearing the casual disrespect younger men often borrow from older men they want to impress. He teased that Sloan said Lena read trauma alerts like sonnets. Without looking up from the screen, Lena remarked that she still read them better than Sloan did. Caleb laughed at first because he assumed it was a joke. Then he noticed she was not smiling. He tried a different approach and asked what branch she had been in, mentioning that she used words like grid and corridor clear in ways that reminded him of his Marine brother. Lena opened a cabinet, checked tubing, and shut it again before telling him that his brother probably knew better than to guess at another person's history. He backed off, but after he left, he kept glancing over his shoulder. Something about her had stopped fitting neatly into the category he had borrowed from Sloan. The third sign came from the oldest orderly on nights, Mr. Warren, who had spent so many years in hospitals that his instincts had outlived every trendy management philosophy the building ever embraced. He watched Lena recheck the bay setup and commented that storms always got her thinking. When she asked what he meant, he observed that she heard rotor wash before everyone else, and that the only people he had known who did that had learned the sound the hard way. She gave him a small, unreadable look, and he let the matter drop. That was his gift. He had seen enough to know when understanding mattered more than prying. The department moved on with its normal low-level emergencies, but the atmosphere had changed by a degree. Not visibly, not enough for anyone to name, just enough that the night had started leaning toward something. The first ambulance arrived carrying a fractured shoulder, a concussed petty officer, and the anxious repetition of one question from the injured man about whether the commander had made it onto the helicopter. The second came 6 minutes later with support crew and a medic whose sleeve was dark to the elbow. That medic walked in under his own power, refused treatment, and scanned the room the instant he crossed the threshold. His eyes did not search for the attending or security. They went directly to Lena and held there with the sharpened focus of recognition. He did not speak immediately, but the look itself contained history. Sloan emerged because the visible increase in urgency made the department feel important, and he began issuing corridor orders with his usual public certainty. Lena assigned triage in a sequence Sloan disliked. He declared it wrong. The medic contradicted him without hesitation and said she had already saved his commander before Sloan even arrived. Sloan laughed it off for the residents, told the medic to let the professionals take over, and missed the fact that when the medic looked ready to say more, Lena gave the slightest shake of her head and he obeyed her instantly. Sloan saw the obedience. He just interpreted it through the wrong lens. By the time the helicopter doors opened the storm had deepened enough to needle rain sideways under the awning. Security had cleared the ambulance lane because black SUVs had arrived ahead of the aircraft, and the men and women stepping from them carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of military command. Different uniforms appeared in the mix, suggesting joint concern rather than a routine transfer. Commander Gabriel Thorne arrived half-conscious, oxygen mask displaced, chest bound, left side badly bruised, blood pressure unstable. He was not old enough to look mythic and not young enough to look reckless. The sparse transfer file labeled it a training incident, possible blast injury, possible internal bleeding, secure chain requested. The medics moved with disciplined economy until Sloan broke the rhythm by demanding the report in the order most flattering to his position rather than the order most useful to the patient. Lena ignored the performance and placed her stethoscope where the truth was. Diminished breath sounds on the left. Trachea not yet shifted but threatening. Pressure falling too fast for the visible blood loss. She asked whether a needle had already been used in the field. The transport medic confirmed a temporary decompression had been performed, but had lost effect in flight. That was enough. She knew what needed to happen and when. Sloan heard only the challenge embedded in her conclusion. He forbade action, insisted the patient was too unstable for improvisation, and ordered radiology instead of life-saving intervention. Then Thorne found her through the lights and breathed the call siren again, stronger this time in implication than in volume. Two military escorts turned so abruptly that one struck the counter behind him. Sloan asked what had been said, but no one answered. Lena reached for the decompression tray. Sloan threatened her job in front of witnesses. The monitor dipped into the 70s. Lena told him again to take his hand off her. When he did, partly because her comm gave him nowhere to push and partly because he assumed he could blame her afterward, she inserted the needle. Air escaped. The chest rose more easily. Saturation climbed. The transport medic finally exhaled as if he too had been suffocating. Sloan recovered first in the only way he knew how. He called it luck. Lena gave orders for the chest tube setup, massive transfusion protocol, warmed products, and backup access if the current line failed. Caleb tried to protest that a physician had not initiated MTP. Lena replied that the patient met the criteria and that the policy was already written. He moved, not because her tone was forceful, but because it was correct. The next 20 minutes had the elastic quality that crisis always creates. Everything happened at once and yet with startling specificity. Sloan tried to reclaim command by talking faster. Lena reclaimed it by being right more often. She saw blood pressure dropping before the monitor alarmed. She corrected an intern's line placement without humiliating him. She requested products in ratios that made one of the medics study her as though lining her face up against an old memory. She called for portable ultrasound before Sloan thought to do it and recognized fluid quickly enough to shave minutes off the OR notification. Then came the second save. A resident, following a standard trauma protocol sheet, reached for a sedative that would have quietly worsened the patient's instability given the transfer allergy notation and current medication profile. Lena intercepted the syringe mid-pass and stopped the administration. Sloan ordered it anyway. Lena told the resident to read the lower right corner of the second page of the transfer note. He did, and his face changed immediately. He informed Sloan that she was correct. Sloan pivoted and said to use the alternate instead. Lena did not embarrass him in the moment. She simply set aside the wrong syringe and prepared the safe one herself. That was the point at which the room began to understand the scale of what had been hiding in plain sight. Commander Thorne drifted in and out, pain held only just with intolerable limits. During one brief lull, he caught Lena's sleeve and conveyed in fragments that he had not expected it to be her. Lena answered with dry practicality and told him he was not allowed to make the night interesting. One medic laughed in disbelief, because whatever old history existed between them clearly ran far deeper than a routine patient-nurse interaction. When the OR was finally ready, Sloan positioned himself at the head of the bed to reclaim the scene before it left his control. He did not notice that Thorne's hand had found Lena's forearm again, nor did he hear the injured commander murmur that she was still the best in the dark. The stretcher rattled into the corridor and through the OR doors. Lena stayed beside him until those doors closed and the immediate work gave way to aftermath. Outside the operating room, one of the military escorts approached her directly for the first time. He was older, broad through the shoulders, army by patch, and had the kind of face where it turns into something almost geological. He addressed her with the soft respect of someone speaking to a person he had hoped and perhaps not expected to see again. She recognized him as Colonel Elias Brenner, and their brief exchange made it clear that the familiarity was real and old. He mentioned that command would want to speak with her. Lena answered that she was still on shift and that her patients needed coverage first. Brenner accepted that immediately. Sloan emerged from the ore doors in time to hear enough of this to understand that the nurse he had just threatened was known by senior military personnel in ways he had never imagined. Unfortunately, he made the worst possible inference. Rather than pause and recalibrate, he decided he needed to discipline her before anyone with more authority clarified why they knew her. At 4:12, while Thorne was still in surgery, Sloan convened an impromptu review at the nurse station with 2 residents, Patris, and the overnight administrator on speakerphone. He held the meeting in the open on purpose, because humiliation functions best as an audience sport. He instructed that the records show Nurse Morales had performed an invasive intervention without physician authorization and had repeatedly disrupted chain of command during a secured military intake. Caleb looked visibly ill. Patris clutched her clipboard too tightly. Lena stood across from them with dried rain on the hem of her scrub pants and fresh gloves tucked into one pocket. She stated plainly that the intervention had been an emergency thoracic decompression performed under standing protocol for a decompensating trauma patient when delay presented an immediate threat to life. Sloan called that her interpretation. She answered that it was the hospital's policy, not merely her opinion. He accused her of enjoying the role of hero and of creating legal exposure by contradicting him in front of armed escorts. Lena said she enjoyed patients surviving. The line landed in the station harder than any raised voice would have. What Sloan could not tolerate was not that she had been wrong, because by then everyone knew she had not. What he could not tolerate was that she had stepped outside the version of her he found most convenient. He removed her from trauma leadership for the remainder of the shift, barred her from contacting military command, speaking to media, or entering OR recovery without his approval, and did so while the speakerphone administrator murmured procedural agreement without verifying a single policy. Patris suggested weakly that perhaps they should wait for the full chart. Sloan ignored her. The word he used most pointedly was hero, not as praise but as accusation, as a way to make life-saving judgment sound like arrogance. Lena stood with her hands folded and answered only that she preferred patients alive. The moral center of the room shifted a fraction then. People understood more than they admitted. The problem was not ignorance. It was cowardice. The humiliation did not stop at the station. Sloan ensured that it traveled. He reassigned Lena to observation overflow and medication reconciliation, the least visible labor on the floor. Within her hearing, he described hero complexes as common in undersupervised nursing cultures. He discussed boundary issues with a resident while looking directly at her badge. The cruelty of it was petty rather than dramatic, which made it more recognizably institutional. Great wrongs in workplaces rarely begin with grand evil. They begin with small procedural degradations delivered by people who trust the system to convert pettiness into official truth. Lena accepted the reassignment without protest. She checked IV rates, comforted an elderly woman waiting too long for an inpatient bed, found a blanket for a teenager with appendicitis, and quietly re-entered orders another nurse had missed. While the people with more status spent their energy defending pride, he kept the department functioning. It was dignified, and because it was dignified, exhausting. Mr. Warren rolled a linen cart past her around and observed that bad men always got louder before daylight. Lena almost smiled and asked if that came from somewhere. He said it came from being old. A short while later, Patris approached with the printed incident report and asked for Lena's signature acknowledging receipt. Lena read the document. It described unauthorized intervention, disruptive communication, and failure to defer to physician authority. She stated plainly that it was false. Patris replied that the signature was only for receipt, not agreement, and urged her not to make it worse. Lena asked, very quietly, for whom it would become worse. Patris looked away. Lena signed the receipt line, wrote disputed in clean block letters, and handed the paper back. Sloan saw the word and smiled like a man who believed procedure belonged only to people like him. He did not yet understand that meticulous documentation was one of Lena's oldest languages. At 5:03, word came down from the OR that Commander Thorne was alive. The update was brief, all efficiency and controlled relief, stable transfer to ICU, complications contained, prognosis guarded but improved. The department released a collective breath. Sloan immediately moved to reclaim the outcome as evidence of strong team response under pressure. No one rushed to agree. Caleb looked at him as though swallowing something bitter. Then an ICU nurse called downstairs to ask specifically whether Nurse Morales was still on shift, explaining that the patient had regained partial consciousness during transfer and had asked twice for her by name. Sloan intercepted the call himself and informed the ICU that the nurse was unavailable, that all communication should route through physician staff. Lena heard every word and did not react outwardly, but the hand holding a med cup tightened once and relaxed. That was the moment even the slower observers began to sense the pettiness had crossed into something uglier. It is one thing to sideline a subordinate after a conflict. It is another to actively block a recovering patient from the person he is seeking, not because the patient's care requires it, but because the hierarchy has been embarrassed. At 5:26, the first SUV rolled under the awning. Then came another and another, headlights sweeping rain and wet concrete in hard white bands. Security straightened before credentials were even shown. The front doors opened, and the incoming group reduced the volume of the lobby without saying much. The first to speak was a woman in service dress whose calm authority made civilians around her adjust themselves instinctively. Rear Admiral June Holloway asked about the 0317 intake. The clerk, nervous and trying to be useful, offered Dr. Sloan as the attending. Holloway clarified that he was not who they were looking for. Then Colonel Brenner stepped through the doors behind her, water still darkening his shoulders, and asked where Nurse Lena Morales was. The question moved through the station like an electric current. Not the attending, not charge, not administration. Lena. Sloan stepped forward anyway, offering to brief them on Commander Thorne's condition. Holloway passed over him the way one passes over signage while continuing toward the actual destination. She repeated the question. Sloan tried to insist that any official communication must route through him. Brenner replied, with the grave patience of a man who had handled lesser obstacles than hospital ego, that this was not how the morning was going to work. Lena was in observation for adjusting a pump alarm when Mr. Warren appeared in the doorway and told her she had weather. She understood immediately. She handed off the chart, stepped into the corridor, and found half the department openly watching. Holloway crossed to her in measured steps and addressed her formally, then less formally, acknowledging a pre-existing relationship with the ease of someone who did not need to establish it. In front of everyone, the Admiral asked whether Lena had performed the emergency thoracic decompression, whether anyone had instructed her not to, whether she had proceeded because delay threatened the patient's life, and whether she had documented the intervention. Lena answered yes to each question. Holloway then handed a sealed envelope to the hospital administrator who had hurried down from the executive floor and informed him that all incident actions involving Lena were to be paused pending immediate review. When Sloan demanded to know on what grounds, Holloway finally gave him the part of the truth the department could understand in one blow. She stated that the nurse he had attempted to sideline 30 minutes after she saved a high-value patient was not only fully authorized under emergency standing protocol, but was also a federally recognized trauma systems consultant whose training materials were currently used by 3 branches of service. For a few seconds, no one in the station breathed properly. Patris's clipboard shifted awkwardly against her hip. Caleb looked as though every assumption he had casually borrowed about Lena was being dismantled inside his skull in real time. Sloan tried to suggest there had to be some mistake. Brenner observed that error did indeed appear to be the theme of the morning. The reveal did not arrive all at once because truths that do real damage rarely do. Holloway requested a conference room, the security camera footage, incident report copies, medication logs, and timeline stamps. She asked for them with the tone of someone who assumed compliance because resistance would merely create more evidence. Then Brenner asked Lena in front of everyone whether the patient had used her call sign. She confirmed that he had. Sloan, unable to stop himself, asked what call sign. Holloway answered that it was the very one the patient had whispered while the nurse was keeping him alive. Brenner supplied the word the room would remember for years. Ren. One younger nurse, unable to contain her curiosity, asked what it meant. Lena could have answered. She chose not to. Brenner explained that before the hospital knew her as Nurse Morales, she had served first as a combat medic and later as a critical care nurse attached to a joint trauma readiness program. Different uniform, same hands, same voice. In 2 separate operations, she had kept teams alive long enough to get them home, and on one of those nights, Commander Thorne had been among them. Sloan attempted one last escape through bureaucracy, claiming that if any of that were true, it should have been in her file. Holloway answered that it had been, in the restricted federal notation the institution had filed and apparently never understood. Patris, stunned and stripped of her earlier certainty, asked why Lena had never said anything. Lena answered with the single clean logic that exposed everyone else in the building. She had been hired to do the job, not narrate her biography. Nothing more was needed. The conference room held the next layer of truth. Present were the hospital administrator, Sloan, Patris, Caleb, the charge nurse, legal counsel by video, Rear Admiral Holloway, Colonel Brenner, and Lena herself. Rain streaked the high windows while a recording light came on above the table. Holloway placed a thin folder on the surface and explained that it was a fictionalized civilian disclosure summary prepared from a fuller, restricted record. It contained enough. Lena had begun in Army enlisted trauma support, completed nursing credentials through a military pathway, cross-trained into critical care transport and joint trauma systems instruction, and later moved into civilian practice without falsifying any element of her resume. What she had omitted, because she was neither required nor apparently inclined to market herself, included multiple commendations, theater citations, and instructor status in emergency thoracic intervention, shock management, and prolonged field care transition. Sloan stared at the paper as though betrayal had occurred. Then Brenner added the point that reframed the hospital's own ignorance in almost comical terms. The decompression protocol Lena had used that night, including the adapted civilian standing order language in St. Catherine's own manual, was based on a training packet she had co-authored after a joint review board. The title under which it appeared differed, but the author was the same woman they had just tried to write up for using it. The administrator went pale. He asked with dawning horror whether the staff had attempted to discipline the very person whose protocol justified the intervention. Holloway said that was among the problems, yes. Caleb made a short, helpless sound because embarrassment and awe had finally become indistinguishable for him. Sloan still tried to fight. He argued that regardless of background, Lena had undermined physician authority in a controlled trauma environment. That was the first time she looked directly at him for longer than a passing second. She said it had not been controlled. It had been deteriorating. He called that her opinion. She answered that it was the timestamp on the monitor, the transfer note from Medevac, the respiratory change he had missed, and the medication interaction she had stopped before it reached the line. Legal counsel immediately asked for clarification on the medication issue. Caleb, unable to hide now, confirmed that there had indeed been an order discrepancy and that Nurse Morales had identified it prior to administration. Sloan insisted the order had only been in process, but the timestamps did not support him. For the first time that night, someone beneath him in rank contradicted him in an official room, and the room tilted. Justice, if it is going to feel real rather than theatrical, M. Oves through paperwork, testimony, and sequence. That is how it began. Holloway requested the incident report Lena had signed and passed it to legal. Counsel asked Sloan whether he had reviewed Standing Protocol Section 8.4 before authoring the phrases unauthorized intervention and outside role. Sloan danced around his understanding until counsel repeated the question plainly. He had not. Counsel then asked whether he was aware that Section 8.4 explicitly permitted licensed nursing intervention in rapidly decompensating thoracic trauma when physician delay presented imminent threat and documentation followed. Sloan admitted that he was aware of it now. Counsel asked whether he had known that before ordering Lena removed from trauma duties. Again, he had to answer no. Every note taken by legal deepened the texture of consequence. The medication issue came next. Caleb's statement was entered. The Medevac transfer page was displayed. The allergy notation and pressure risk were visible in black and white. Sloan attempted to reframe the matter as an order still in process, but the timing showed the verbal push toward administration had happened before correction. Lena had prevented the medication from reaching the line. Patris's involvement followed. She admitted that the incident report had been generated before all facts were reviewed, that Lena had signed only to acknowledge receipt, and that the disputed notation was hers. She also admitted that Sloan had repeatedly described Lena's conduct using the language of a hero complex, not as admiration but as accusation. Then came the security footage from the trauma bay. At first it played without audio. Bodies moved. One figure obstructed, one assessed, the monitor fell, the intervention occurred, and the patient improved. Even on mute, competence and ego were visible. When the audio was enabled, the room had to hear Sloan threat that if she touched the patient without his order, she could clean out her locker by sunrise. No one looked at Lena while that line played, because shame rarely knows where to put its face. Outside the conference room, truth spread through the hospital with the strange speed institutions reserved for scandal and fairness when they occur together. The ICU learned that the quiet overnight nurse had been the one the commander asked for before and after surgery. The OR staff learned she had intercepted the medication error. Younger nurses learned that the phrase hero complex had been aimed at someone whose actual record could have instructed most of the floor. People who had laughed with Sloan began silently revising their own memories to make themselves appear less involved. By 6:28, day shift staff were arriving into an atmosphere so charged they sensed it before clipping badges to coats. Mr. Warren, folding linen with the composure of a man whose worldview had just been confirmed rather than shaken, observed that a lot of people had met themselves before breakfast. The most devastating confrontations are often the least theatrical because every path of escape is removed by fact rather than rage. At 6:41, Commander Thorne's executive officer arrived from the ICU with a request for a formal patient statement. Thorne was awake enough for limited testimony and had insisted. The request was approved. They moved to an ICU briefing space where morning light had begun thinning the darkness outside. Thorne lay propped up, pale but unmistakably present, looking less like myth and more like what he was, a tired man who had come close to not surviving the night. Lena stood near the foot of the bed without crowding him. Sloan had preferred not to attend. Holloway required it. Legal asked Thorne to identify the person he had requested after surgery. He named Lena Morales directly. Asked whether he had known her before admission, he said he had. Asked in what capacity, he answered with deadly simplicity that she had saved his life before. The statement was so spare that it carried more weight than ornament would have. Counsel asked about the call sign. Thorne explained that Wren had been what his team called her because in the worst conditions, when communications were poor and no one could see more than a few feet, her voice cut through like a direction home. He described it without romance, which made it truer. Sloan made one last attempt to retreat into protocol, arguing that familiarity did not alter hospital process. Thorne turned his head toward him, and even injured there was command in the gesture. He replied that familiarity did not alter protocol, but it did sharpen his confidence in the person who recognized he was dying while Sloan was occupied with being in charge of it. It was the kind of rebuke that left no dramatic debris and no usable defense. The room changed again, not because everyone suddenly loved Lena, but because all the polite structures protecting denial had finally collapsed. What followed was not revenge, that distinction mattered. Revenge would have centered emotion. This centered records. The hospital administrator, fully aware now that the case had become both liability and proof of broader cultural failure, suspended Sloan from patient-facing duties pending formal peer review. The suspension was immediate. Badge access was restricted to administrative areas. All incident reports authored by him that night were frozen for audit. His conduct toward nursing staff, possible retaliation, and judgment under stress were all placed under active investigation. Patris was placed under supervisory review for participating in retaliatory workflow reassignment and for failing to validate facts before disciplinary action. The overnight administrator on speaker had the misfortune of being preserved in call logs using phrases like defer to attending without having checked a single protocol. Legal requested everything. No one shouted. No one pounded a table. It was all signatures, timestamps, effective immediately, and preserve all records. To the people who had grown comfortable mistreating others under the shadows of hierarchy, that bureaucratic language sounded far more frightening than anger. Sloan tried to frame the response as disproportionate. Holloway answered that a near-fatal delay, a documented attempt to sideline a life-saving clinician, and retaliatory action against a protected federal consultant in the wake of military patient harm concerns were not disproportionate matters. They were proportion finally arriving. Then Sloan turned to Lena and said the most revealing thing he had said all night. He told her that she could have said something, not that he was sorry. Not that he had been wrong, only that she could have announced herself more clearly so he might have recognized value. Lena held his gaze and answered that she had said something. He had simply only trusted certain voices. It was not a line meant to sting. That made it final. Some sentences do not end arguments. They end eras. After the suspensions came a strange lull, the stunned quiet that follows structural impact. Day shift had fully arrived. Nurses who had heard only fragments now saw the principals moving through the hallway with brittle caution. Security hovered near administration. Legal remained on call. Coffee cooled untouched. Someone finally offered Lena a chair. She did not take it. She asked instead whether her patients had coverage. The administrator said it could be arranged. Lena replied that then it should be arranged, because she needed to give report first. The answer circulated through the hall almost instantly. Even after vindication had begun, she was still measuring herself against duty rather than drama. That, more than any decorated file, forced people to confront how badly they had read her. Patris found her alone near the medication room later and admitted she should have stopped it, meaning the report, the comments, the whole drift of cowardice that had hardened into action. Lena asked which part she meant. Patris said all of it. Lena told her that she had known enough to doubt what was happening and that the real failure had been confusing doubt with permission. It was not cruel, which made it hard to shrug off. Caleb approached afterward, stripped now of the borrowed swagger he had worn earlier in the night. He admitted that he should have spoken sooner. Lena agreed. Then, because she was not interested in theatrics for their own sake, she also noted that he had spoken when it counted in review and needed to learn the correct lesson from that. When he asked what lesson that was, she told him that silence could sometimes be discipline, but cowardice was silence used to protect comfort. Caleb stood there absorbing it like the beginning of adulthood. At the army convoy formally requested Lena's presence. A transport officer carried paper to the desk asking that Nurse Lena Morales accompany command for a secure debrief regarding the patient's statement and a historical identification matter tied to his operative record. The phrase alone generated another ripple of whispers, but Brenner dismissed the curiosity with the pragmatic half-truth that it was paperwork. It was not only paperwork. It was also delayed recognition, blurred records, and the return of a past Lena had not volunteered to anyone in the building. Brenner met her near the elevators, away from the onlookers, and told her she could decline. He added that Thorne had specifically requested her. Then he said something that reached deeper than rank or policy. Thorne had believed for a year that she was dead. They all had. Lena's face did not break, but her eyes shifted just once as if a sealed chamber in memory had opened. She answered that he had received the wrong report. Brenner said they all had, and that for some people the error had been convenient. He did not push further. He only told her that whatever she decided, no one was making her disappear again. Of Ev. Everything the hospital had heard that morning. That line perhaps came closest to exposing the unseen cost beneath her quiet. Before any debrief, Lena chose to go to the ICU. The room was calmer now, morning light filtering in through half-open blinds and turning railings and machine edges gold. The storm had moved inland. Thorne looked less fragile, though every movement still cost him. Lena entered, took one look at him, and let dry wit do the work of easing what heavier emotion might have broken. She conveyed that he looked terrible. He, in turn, let relief and disbelief occupy the same expression as he studied her face long enough to accept that she was truly there. He mentioned that after Kandahar they had all been told she was gone. She answered that this was not Kandahar. He agreed, noting that the present situation was somehow stranger. For the first time, she laughed briefly and without armor. The ICU nurse, sensing the importance of privacy more keenly than many of the people who had outranked her that morning, found a reason to step out. Thorne said he had heard the way Sloane had spoken to her before surgery. Lena answered that it had been handled. He said that was not the point. When she asked what was, he admitted that people like her should not have to keep proving themselves to people like that. She looked toward the blinds and observed that people like her always did. The trick, she said, was making sure the proof served the patient rather than pride. He let that truth settle. Then, with the awkwardness of a man more accustomed to command than vulnerability, he said her call sign again. Not as battlefield identification this time, not as the desperate recognition of a body on the edge, but as gratitude stripped of performance. He thanked her for finding him twice. That private moment mattered as much as the public reversal, because not every form of justice arrives in a conference room. Sometimes the deepest vindication is simply being remembered accurately by the person who knows exactly what you did when no applause was available. The official aftermath stretched over weeks, even though later retellings compressed it into a single extraordinary dawn. Peer review upheld the decompression as timely, life-saving, and fully compliant with standing protocol. The retaliation finding was substantiated. Sloane's suspension widened into a credential and conduct review that reached beyond that one night into older patterns. Former complaints surfaced. They were not cinematic complaints, just the small warnings institutions ignore until a bigger crisis forces them to care. Dismissive language, repeated undermining of nursing judgment, a pattern of overriding caution when challenged in front of witnesses. The patient's status had made the incident impossible to bury, but the deeper truth was that Sloane had selected the wrong target. Lena's documentation was precise. Her timeline matched footage, medevac notes, resident statements, and patient testimony. The quiet nurse he had imagined easy to corner had kept records the way others keep weapons. Patris retained employment but lost supervisory authority and requested transfer before the recommendation formally landed. Some staff interpreted that as mercy. Others thought it was avoidance. Caleb requested additional trauma education, and months later, cited Lena with visible respect during a case review that made it clear the lesson had changed him rather than merely shamed him. Mr. Warren, on hearing the eventual administrative outcomes, simply remarked that sunlight did wonders. Administration, for its part, reacted as institutions often do when forced to notice someone they had benefited from overlooking. They offered Lena committee roles, leadership pathways, public recognition, hospital newsletter features, and polished narratives meant to transform a liability event into a donor-friendly symbol of resilience. She declined almost all of it, not from bitterness, but from clarity. She accepted two things. The incident report in her personnel file was formally corrected, and the hospital adopted a revised requirement that all incoming residents and attendings complete quarterly review of emergency standing protocols with nursing-led scenario training attached. When an administrator seemed surprised, she had not asked for more. Lena said she would prefer that next time the right person not need a secret pass to be believed. That answer changed the culture on nights more than any official memo. In the months that followed, the differences were small enough to escape outsiders and large enough to matter to everyone working under fluorescent ceilings at 3:00 a.m. Residents listened longer before correcting. Nurses finished sentences more often. People checked policy before invoking authority. When Lena spoke in a trauma bay, the room no longer heard quietness as hesitation. It heard calibration. She did not become flashier. She did not start telling stories about military service to make others comfortable with respecting her. She remained reserved, dry-witted when she chose, unsparing with sloppy thinking, and kind in the practical, unsentimental ways that matter most when the hour is ugly and the patient is failing. The difference was not that she changed. The difference was that the room had finally been forced to stop lying about what it had been seeing all along. Near the end of summer, Commander Thorne returned to St. Catherine S. under his own power. There were no alarms, no storm, no convoy, just a follow-up appointment and the understated evidence of survival in his gait and the scar hidden beneath his collar. He wore civilian clothes, though nothing about him read as ordinary. The front desk clerk straightened slightly when he approached. An orderly recognized him from the night of the helicopters. A few staff near the elevators noticed when he asked one simple question, whether Nurse Morales was on duty. He was told she was in trauma too. He thanked the clerk and walked there without escort. Lena was resetting a room after a transfer when he appeared. Gloves on, monitor leads coiled, curtains half open, she looked up and assessed him with the same dry economy she applied to everything. Her first judgment was that he looked less expensive than last time. He answered that recovery had apparently humbled him, though not completely. He carried a small shadow box and held it out. Inside was a decommissioned patch and a brass nameplate engraved with the call sign Ren. Lena's first reaction was procedural. She said she could not accept unit memorabilia. Thorne explained that it was cleared, decommissioned, and bureaucratically sanitized by Brenner, who apparently enjoyed terrifying compliance officers. That earned another small laugh from her. He added that there was also a letter from the men who had come home because she had been there, some of whom had only recently learned where to send it. She did not take the box immediately. That hesitation told the watching staff more than instant acceptance could have. Praise sat heavier on her than labor ever had. Finally, she accepted it and thanked him. He glanced around the room and observed that the residents now addressed her more formally. She noted that this could be interpreted as professional growth. He suggested they were a little afraid of her. She answered that what they should really fear was documentation. Then Thorne did the one thing the corridor would remember longest. He straightened in full view of the doorway and gave her a crisp, unmistakable salute. It was not theatrical or exaggerated. It was precise. The hallway conversation behind him stopped. Lena looked at the salute for one heartbeat, perhaps two, then returned it with the same controlled economy she brought to everything important. The room changed one final time because visible respect had at last caught up with overdue truth. No speech could have done the work of that silence better. A month later, St. Catherine's hosted its annual Trauma Preparedness Symposium, usually a donor-friendly event weighted toward polished slides, curated credit, and the sort of institutional self-congratulation that confuses presentation with learning. That year, after a great many uncomfortable meetings, the keynote training block was assigned to Lena. She initially tried to refuse. Holloway, attending in civilian clothes, told her that declining was her right, but occupying the room could also be a service. Lena accepted on those terms alone. When she stepped to the podium, she did not tell a heroic version of her own life. She taught. She spoke about decompensation patterns hidden behind noise, about the danger of mistaking certainty for competence, about how authority should accelerate good decisions rather than delay them, and about the necessity of listening across rank when seconds matter. She used no names and offered no gossip. She did not humiliate anyone, which made the effect stronger. Many of the people who had once laughed at her were in attendance. They took notes. She closed that session with a sentence the room did not forget. Some of the best clinicians in any room, she said, are often the ones speaking least, and if a team can only hear confidence when it arrives in the voice it expects, patients will pay for that bias. No applause came immediately because the silence after the line was too full. Then enough people stood that the meaning could not be ignored. Not everyone, not dramatically, but enough. Justice had become not only the consequence faced by the wrong people, but the survival of the right lesson beyond them. By winter, the story had already become hospital folklore, though the version told in break rooms was always smaller than the truth. They said the army had come looking for a nurse and ignored the doctor. They said a SEAL commander woke up asking for a woman by a name no one understood. They said a chain of command awed through the ED before dawn and flipped the power structure in a single hour. All of that was true. What the folklore usually missed was the long middle, the months during which Lena had been misread, diminished, and required to compress her competence for the comfort of others. People love the reveal in stories like this. They are less interested in the endurance that made the reveal meaningful. But endurance is where character actually lives. Years later, new nurses on nights would still hear fragments if they asked the right people. Mr. Warren, if he was still there, would tell it one way. Older ICU staff would tell it another. Caleb, having become the kind of physician who listened twice before speaking once, would frame it as the night he learned what authority should feel like. All their versions would share the same core. There had been a nurse who did not look like power to people who only recognized it in approved packaging. There had been a doctor who mistook rank for wisdom. There had been a night when a patient important enough to expose the rot arrived at exactly the wrong time for all the wrong people. And there had been a whisper, the soft syllable of a call sign that tore through months of disrespect in less than a breath, and named a truth before anyone else in the hospital was prepared to hear it. Lena kept the shadow box in a drawer at home rather than on display. That mattered too. Some people collect symbols to grow larger in the eyes of others. Some tuck them away because they were never trying to appear large at all. They were trying to be useful, faithful, and prepared. The symbol meant something, but not more than the work that had earned it. On storm nights when Rotor Wash thudded faintly across Norfolk again, she would sometimes stand at her apartment window with tea cooling in her hands and listen. Not nostalgically, just attentively, as if some part of her would always remain tuned to the sound of incoming need. Some lives never truly leave service. They only change uniforms. Near the end of that year, a brand new resident froze during a difficult intake. There were too many alarms, family crying in the corner, an attending delayed upstairs, and the entire room tightening around a rising center of panic. Lena stepped beside the resident and quietly directed her to begin with what would kill first. The resident identified airway. Lena prompted the next step, breathing, then circulation. When the resident's anxiety tried to overtake her, Lena reminded her not to treat panic as if it were data. The younger woman actually laughed once despite the stress, and that small release was enough to free her hands and mind. The patient stabilized. Afterward, the resident asked how Lena stayed so calm. Lena stripped off her gloves and gave the truest possible answer: practice. She did not mention medals, history, or the parts of herself others still found easier to mythologize than understand. The nurse beside them, one who knew the older story, smiled privately because humility sometimes sounds exactly like that. Practice. That may have been the deepest moral of the whole night. Humility did not mean Lena thought less of her ability. It meant she carried ability in service rather than performance. Integrity did not mean she never felt anger. It meant she refused to let anger make her sloppy. Real respect was not a favor granted by powerful people in moments of generosity. It was overdue recognition of what had already been true before they arrived. On that storm-ridden night at St. Catherine's, a wounded commander lived because one nurse refused to confuse permission with responsibility. An entire room of professionals was forced to learn that silence and weakness are not the same thing. And a woman mocked for her calm was publicly vindicated not by spectacle but by truth that held under scrutiny, testimony, footage, timestamps, and light. That kind of ending lingers because it is rare enough to feel precious and common enough to feel familiar. Somewhere in a hospital, office, school, station, workshop, or family, there's almost always a quiet person carrying more knowledge, discipline, and steadiness than the room has bothered to see. Such people are often not waiting for revenge. They are waiting for the chance to do the work when it matters, and for the work to count even if their voice does not arrive in the preferred register of authority. The official record of that night would eventually flatten into sterile language about patient stabilization, chain of command review, and pending personnel action. Records are useful, but they cannot hold the full human weight of transformation. They cannot capture Caleb's expression when he understood respect should have come before revelation. They cannot fully hold the hush that fell when the army ignored everyone prestigious and asked only for Lena Morales. They cannot preserve the exact force of Rear Admiral Holloway's calm, as she refused Ed to let false paperwork stand. And they cannot contain the private gravity of a recovering commander looking at the nurse who had found him in the dark twice, and naming her as though the truth itself had finally reached a room worthy of hearing it. In the end, what changed St. Catherine was not merely that Lena's secret credentials were exposed. The deeper change came from the collapse of a lie. The lie had been that confidence naturally belongs to those who project it most loudly, that authority naturally belongs to those who occupy its visible symbols, and that people who do not advertise themselves probably have less to offer. That lie had structured the floor for months. It shaped how residents listened, how charge nurses aligned themselves, how attendings moved through space, and how administration interpreted friction. The night Commander Thorne arrived did not create the lie, but it forced the lie into a crisis severe enough that it could no longer survive unchallenged. Once footage, testimony, and old history converged, the institution had to choose whether to protect its hierarchy or its own stated values. For one rare morning, with enough pressure from outside and enough proof from within, it chose correctly. Even so, the most meaningful part of the story was never that military command knew Lena's name. It was that Lena herself had never needed command, rank, or applause to know what her responsibility was. She had recognized a deteriorating chest before a room full of titles did. She had intervened under threat to her job because delay would have cost a life. She had stopped a medication error while being actively undermined. She had continued caring for ordinary patients after being humiliated because her integrity was tied to the work rather than to recognition. Then, when recognition came in force, she had used it not to magnify her own legend, but to alter policy so that the next competent, quiet person might be believed sooner. That is why the story endures. Not because a secret past was glamorous, but because character held long before anyone knew how to label it. If someone had asked Lena to summarize that night in the months afterward, she likely would have done what she always did and reduced it to essentials. A trauma patient came in unstable. Intervention was delayed. She acted. He lived. Review followed. Systems corrected. The summary would have been technically accurate and emotionally incomplete, exactly the way official language so often is. But beneath that clinical reduction lived the real story, the one people kept repeating because it answered a hunger larger than entertainment. It answered the hope that competence can eventually cut through bias, that institutions can sometimes be forced to look at themselves honestly, and that quiet courage, though slow to be recognized, is still courage. It answered the dread many people carry of being unseen until disaster proves what they could have told everyone all along. And it offered a form of justice that felt more satisfying than revenge, because it rested on evidence, memory, and the simple refusal of one person to let another person die for the sake of hierarchy. By the time the city forgot the storm that had drenched the awning and blurred the medevac route, the staff at St. Catherine's had not forgotten the sound of the trauma bay doors that morning or the stillness that followed the whispered call sign. They had not forgotten the image of Sloane's authority collapsing in increments rather than in one dramatic fall, nor the look on Patris's face when doubt and complicity finally became the same thing. They had not forgotten Colonel Brenner's controlled disgust, Holloway's measured precision, or the way Thorne's gaze found Lena even through pain and sedatives, because recognition runs deeper than circumstance. Most of all, they had not forgotten that the person they had spent months reducing to quietness had never actually been diminished by it. She had simply refused to perform herself into their preferred shape. That was the final lesson the hallway salute made visible. Respect had not created Lena's worth. It had only finally aligned with it. The work, the skill, the steadiness, and the old history had all been there before the convoy, before the folder, before the conference room, before the corrected reports. The room did not bestow truth on her. The room merely stopped obstructing it. In too many places, that distinction is the one people miss. They believe justice begins when recognition arrives. In reality, justice begins earlier, in the choices made without guarantee of reward, in the competence exercised while uncelebrated, and in the records kept clean enough to withstand attack. Lena understood that long before anyone else on the floor caught up. So the story of that night is not only the story of a wounded commander saved by the right hands in the right moment. It is also the story of how a hospital learned, dare pressure, that its own survival depended on hearing more carefully. It is the story of a nurse who had already walked through darker places than fluorescent corridors and who had no interest in using those places to decorate herself. It is the story of a man whose life intersected with hers twice at the edge of loss and who remembered accurately enough to speak the name that mattered. And it is the story of the quiet, almost invisible courage required to keep doing excellent work in rooms that prefer confidence to competence, until reality makes the difference impossible to ignore. Long after the review files were archived and the annual training slides updated, the emotional truth of the night remained simple. A door banged open. Rain came in. A man was dying. One person in the room knew it clearly enough to act. Everything that followed, from the paperwork to the convoy to the salute, was only the world catching up to that first calm decision. That is why the story feels true even as fiction. Because every workplace has its hidden hierarchy, every crisis reveals what performance can no longer hide, and every so often a quiet person does the necessary thing under pressure so unmistakably that no one present can ever again pretend not to know who they are. And if there is one image worth keeping when all the rest has been reduced to record, rumor, and retelling, it is not the conference room or the corrected policy or even the shadow box in the drawer at home. It is the instant in the trauma bay when the monitor fell, the room stalled, and Lena saw what the patient needed before anyone else allowed themselves to believe it. In that second, nothing public existed yet. No convoy, no reveal, no vindication, no audience. There was only skill, judgment, and responsibility. Everything meaningful was already there. The rest of the night only proved it to people who should have known sooner.